The night my daughter-in-law sneered at me and told me to pay my own bills was the moment something inside me finally went quiet. Not angry, not loud, just finished. My son stood beside her nodding like it was nothing, like years of sacrifice could be dismissed with a shrug. They spoke as if I were a burden, a guest overstaying his welcome, not the man who had quietly kept their lights on, their mortgage paid, their comfort protected, while I slept alone in a house still echoing with my late wife's absence. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I simply looked around the room I had helped sustain and realized they believed they no longer needed me. That night I packed a single bag and walked out without slamming a door. What they did not know was that silence can be more dangerous than confrontation. Over the next weeks, I watched from a distance as confidence turned into confusion, then fear. Bills went unpaid, calls went unanswered, and then one evening my phone rang. Her voice was sharp with panic, stripped of arrogance, demanding to know what I had done. In that moment, I understood something powerful. Revenge does not always arrive with shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it comes calmly, deliberately, and with perfect timing. Stay with me, because what I chose to say next did not just change their lives, it gave me back mine, and the truth behind it will leave you questioning how many quiet people you have underestimated. My name is Arthur Sinclair. I am 67 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges and highways across the Northeast. My wife Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, and since then I have been living in my son's guest room, trying to be useful, trying to belong somewhere. What I did not realize until that night was how completely I had failed at both. The dinner started like any other Sunday evening at Daniel and Lauren's house. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can. Lauren never was much of a cook, but I learned early in my time there not to offer suggestions. I learned to make myself small, to take up as little space as possible, to be grateful for every meal placed in front of me, even when the portions grew smaller and the conversation grew colder. I helped clear the table that night, as I always did. It was my way of contributing, of earning my keep in a house where I increasingly felt like a piece of furniture that had outlived its purpose. I stacked the plates, carefully wiped down the placemats, moved quietly so as not to disturb whatever television program Lauren had already turned her attention toward. That was when I heard her voice. She was speaking to Daniel, who sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. She did not look at me. She did not acknowledge that I was standing 6 feet away with dishes in my hands. She simply asked the question as if I were not there at all. "When is he going back to his place? I need that room for something." I stopped moving. The plates in my hands suddenly felt heavier than they should have. I waited for Daniel to respond, to say something, anything that would remind his wife that I was a person and not an inconvenience to be scheduled around. But my son did not look up from his phone. He did not meet my eyes. He just shrugged and mumbled something about talking later. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. I set the plates down gently on the counter. My hands were steady, though something inside my chest had begun to crack. I looked across the room to the photograph of Eleanor that hung near the window. It was a small frame, easily overlooked, but I had asked them to keep it there after she died. In the picture, she was smiling, her eyes bright with that knowing look she always had. She could read people better than anyone I ever knew. She saw through politeness and pretense the way I saw through blueprints and stress calculations. Standing there in that kitchen, surrounded by the family I had supported for over a decade, I heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "When they show you who they are, believe them. And when that day comes, call Thomas first." Those were her final words to me, spoken in the hospital 3 days before she slipped away. I had not understood them then. I thought it was the medication talking, the confusion of a mind preparing to leave this world. But Eleanor was never confused. She was the sharpest person I ever met. She had seen something I refused to see, and she had tried to warn me. I finished cleaning the kitchen in silence. I said goodnight to Daniel, who barely looked up. Lauren did not respond at all. I walked to the guest room that had been my home for 18 months and closed the door behind me. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my hands. These hands had built structures that would stand for 100 years. They had held my wife through her final breath. They had written checks and signed documents and carried grandchildren who were now too busy to visit. And yet somehow, those same hands had failed to build a life where I was wanted. I didn't pack much. One suitcase, a few changes of clothes, my medications, and the small leather folder where I kept important papers. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain to people who had stopped listening years ago. At 11 o'clock that night, I walked out the front door of my son's house. The door I had helped pay for, the house I had helped maintain, the family I had helped support through every crisis and setback for more than 10 years. No one heard me leave. No one called after me. The porch light stayed off. That night I did not run. I finally listened to my wife. I drove for nearly an hour before I pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel 20 miles outside of town. The kind of place where nobody asks questions, and the sheets smell faintly of bleach. I paid cash for 3 nights and carried my single suitcase into a room with a television bolted to the dresser and a window that looked out onto the highway. It was past midnight when I finally sat down on the edge of the bed. The silence was different here. Not the cold, dismissive silence of my son's house, but something emptier. Something that invited memory. And memory came whether I wanted it or not. I thought about the last 10 years. The checks I had written. The problems I had solved. The weight I had carried so quietly that no one ever noticed I was carrying anything at all. When Daniel and Lauren bought their house, they were short on the down payment by nearly $15,000. I covered it without being asked, without expectation of repayment. When the roof needed replacing 3 years later, I wrote another check. $45,000 for renovations over the years, all told. New kitchen cabinets, a finished basement, the kind of improvements that made Lauren proud to host her book club and dinner parties. Then there was her car. Lauren had crashed her sedan into a guardrail during an ice storm, and insurance covered barely half the replacement cost. Daniel called me that night, voice tight with stress, and I transferred $32,000 into their account before the weekend was over. Lauren never mentioned it again, not once. The car simply appeared in their driveway as if it had always been there, as if it had materialized through sheer force of her own success. The grandchildren's school fees came next. $28,000 spread across 3 years paid directly to the academy so the kids could attend the same private school as Lauren's friends' children. I remember signing those checks at my kitchen table, Eleanor watching me with an expression I could not quite read. She never told me not to help. But she never told me I was making a difference either. Perhaps she knew something I did not. There were countless smaller expenses too. Grocery runs when times were tight, emergency repairs when appliances failed, birthday gifts and holiday contributions, and quiet transfers whenever Daniel's voice carried that particular note of shame. I never asked for gratitude. I told myself that family did not keep score, that love meant giving without expectation. But sitting in that motel room, I began to wonder if I had confused generosity with disappearance. One memory surfaced sharper than the others. A dinner party at Daniel's house 4 years ago. Lauren had invited several couples from her social circle, women with expensive haircuts and husbands who talked about golf handicaps and investment portfolios. I stayed in the kitchen most of the evening, refilling water pitchers and clearing plates, trying to be helpful without intruding. That was when I heard Lauren's voice carry through the doorway. She was laughing, gesturing around the renovated dining room with obvious pride. One of her friends had complimented the house, asked how they managed such a beautiful home at their age. "We're completely self-made," Lauren said. "No help from anyone. Daniel and I built this life ourselves." I stood frozen by the sink, a serving platter in my hands. I waited for Daniel to correct her. He was sitting right there at the head of the table. He knew where the money had come from. He knew who had made their comfortable life possible. But my son said nothing. He simply smiled and raised his glass. I never mentioned what I heard. I told myself it did not matter, that pride sometimes makes people forget. But the words stayed with me longer than they should have, like a splinter I could not reach. Another memory followed, softer, but no less significant. A summer afternoon 3 years before Eleanor died. I came home early from an errand and found her leaning over the backyard fence, deep in conversation with Margaret Hill from next door. They stopped talking the moment they saw me, their expression shifting into something carefully neutral. "What were you two discussing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Eleanor smiled, that mysterious smile she had perfected over 40 years of marriage. "Just planning for the future, dear." I did not press further. I never pressed Eleanor on anything. I trusted her completely, and perhaps that trust made me blind to things I should have seen. What I did not know then was that Eleanor had spent years watching what happened to Margaret. 15 years earlier, Margaret's own daughter-in-law had orchestrated her removal from the family home. Legal maneuvers, emotional manipulation, a son too weak to stand against his wife. Margaret lost everything, her house, her savings, her place in her own family. Eleanor had been furious about it for weeks. I remember her pacing our living room, voice sharp with outrage. How could he let that happen to his own mother? How could he just stand there and watch? And then quieter, almost to herself. That will never happen to Arthur. Never. I did not understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was simply expressing sympathy for a neighbor's misfortune. But Eleanor never said anything without purpose. Every word she spoke was a seed planted for a harvest I could not yet see. Sitting in that motel room, surrounded by the hum of highway traffic and the smell of industrial detergent, I finally began to understand. I was not generous. I was invisible. And Eleanor had seen everything I refused to see. The first morning in that motel room began with silence. Not the oppressive silence of being ignored, but something different. Something that belonged to me alone. I woke before dawn and sat by the window in the single chair the room provided. The curtains were thin, letting in the gray light of early morning and the steady rhythm of cars passing on the highway below. $45 a night bought me clean sheets, a working television I never turned on, and a view of strangers going somewhere else. It was more than enough. I waited for the anger to arrive. I had expected it the night before, expected to lie awake with my fists clenched and my mind racing through all the things I should have said, the confrontations I should have demanded, the boundaries I should have drawn years ago. I waited for rage to fill the hollow space in my chest, to give me something to push against, something to fuel whatever came next. But anger never came. What settled over me instead was something colder and quieter, a recognition that had been building for years, buried beneath all my excuses and rationalizations. I had not been mistreated suddenly. I'd been erased gradually, so slowly that I barely noticed the disappearing. First, I was the father who helped. Then I was the father who was expected to help. Then I was simply the help itself, function rather than a person. And finally, I was not even that. I was furniture. I was an inconvenience occupying a room that Lauren needed for something else. The problem had never been about money. I understood that now with a clarity that felt almost painful. I could have given them twice as much, 3 times as much, and nothing would have changed, because the issue was not what I provided. The issue was how they saw me. Somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped seeing his father and started seeing a resource. Lauren never saw me at all. I was simply part of the infrastructure of their lives, like plumbing or electricity, useful when functioning, irritating when noticed. I thought about calling Daniel. I thought about demanding an explanation, an apology, some acknowledgement that I deserved better than to be discussed like an unwanted houseguest in my own presence. I imagined the conversation in my head, the words I would choose, the points I would make. I had been an engineer for 40 years. I knew how to build arguments the same way I knew how to build bridges. Strong foundations, logical progression, weight distributed properly so nothing collapsed under pressure. But then I imagined Daniel's response, the defensiveness, the excuses. Lauren's voice in the background coaching him on what to say, the eventual compromise where I would be allowed back into the guest room with vague promises that things would be different. Promises that would dissolve within weeks. I would return to the same silence, the same invisibility, the same slow erasure. Nothing would change because nothing could change. They did not see me as someone worth changing for. So I made a different decision. I would not argue. I would not explain. I would not plead my case or defend my dignity or try to convince people who had already made up their minds. I would simply remove myself completely. No dramatic exit, no bitter accusations, no desperate attempts to make them understand what they had done. I would just stop. Stop calling. Stop helping. Stop existing in their world. Let them experience life without my invisible support. Let the bills arrive that I had always quietly covered. Let the emergencies happen that I had always quietly solved. Let them discover piece by piece exactly how much I had been holding together without anyone noticing or caring. This was not revenge. Revenge requires anger, and I had none left to give. This was something simpler. This was me finally, after 67 years on this earth, deciding that I mattered enough to stop giving myself away to people who did not value the gift. I sat by that window for a long time, watching the highway traffic increase as morning turned to midday. Trucks hauling freight to distant cities, families in minivans heading toward vacations, salesmen in sedans rushing to appointments, everyone moving, Everyone going somewhere, everyone with a purpose that had nothing to do with me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something like peace. I had spent my entire adult life filling silence with usefulness. If I was helping, I was worthy. If I was providing, I was loved. I had never learned how to simply exist without earning my place. But sitting in that motel room watching the world pass by outside my window, I began to understand that some silences are not empty. Some silences are statements. Some silences are the loudest thing a man can say. I would not beg for a seat at their table. I would not explain why I deserved to be treated with basic dignity. I would not teach grown adults lessons they should have learned decades ago. I would simply be silent and let that silence speak for itself. Silence was not weakness. It was my first boundary in 67 years. On the third morning, I found the courage to make the call I had been avoiding. Eleanor's final words had stayed with me through every sleepless hour in that motel room. When they show you who they are, believe them. And when that day comes, call Thomas first. I had carried those words like a sealed envelope of my own, never quite understanding what they meant, never ready to find out. But sitting alone in that small room with nothing but highway noise and my own thoughts for company, I realized I had run out of reasons to wait. Thomas Keller had been our family attorney for nearly 30 years. He handled our estate planning, our property documents, the quiet legal architecture that held a lifetime together. Eleanor trusted him completely, and that trust had always been enough for me. I dialed his office number from memory. The receptionist put me through immediately as if my name had been flagged for priority. 2 rings later, Thomas answered. Arthur? His voice carried something I could not quite identify, relief perhaps, or anticipation. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years. I didn't know how to respond to that. I had expected pleasantries, condolences, the usual awkward dance of reconnection after a long silence. Instead, Thomas spoke as if he had been counting the days until this moment. Eleanor left instructions, he continued before I could find words. Very specific instructions. She made me promise to follow them exactly no matter how long it took. Instructions about what? About you. About what to do when you finally called. He paused, and I heard papers shuffling on his end. She left a sealed envelope in my care. The conditions were explicit. I could only open it when you left your son's house. Not before. Not under any other circumstances, only when you walked away from Daniel and Lauren on your own terms. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. She knew, I said quietly. She knew this would happen. She didn't know exactly when, but she knew who. Thomas's voice softened with something like admiration. She called Lauren the one who counts other people's money. Said she'd been watching that woman calculate your worth since the day Daniel brought her home. Eleanor told me it was only a matter of time before Lauren decided you'd given enough. I closed my eyes and saw my wife's face, that knowing smile, those sharp eyes that missed nothing. All those years I thought I was protecting our family, and Eleanor had been protecting me. What's in the envelope, Thomas? Property documents, the house on Maple Street where you grew up, your family's original home. He paused to let this word settle. Eleanor transferred it into your name alone 3 years before she died. Full ownership. No joint title with Daniel, no inheritance complications. It's yours, Arthur. It's always been yours, worth somewhere around $380,000 at current market value. I couldn't speak. The house on Maple Street had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the front porch with his own hands. My father taught me to ride a bicycle in that driveway. I had assumed it would eventually pass to Daniel as part of our estate, another piece of myself that I would give away without question. But Eleanor had seen further than I ever could. Lauren can't touch it, Thomas continued. Daniel has no legal claim. Eleanor made certain of that. She restructured everything quietly, made sure the paperwork was airtight. She told me once that she wasn't trying to punish anyone. She was trying to make sure you had somewhere to land when they finally pushed you out the door. My throat tightened. 42 years of marriage and Eleanor was still taking care of me, still anticipating the dangers I refused to see, still building bridges to safety that I did not know I would need. There's something else, Thomas said carefully. A second envelope. Eleanor was very clear that I shouldn't mention it until you were ready, and you're not ready yet, Arthur, not today. What do you mean? I mean, there's more to this than property transfers. Eleanor documented things, observations, patterns she noticed over the years. He chose his next words with obvious care. She wanted you to understand the full picture eventually. But she also knew that some truths need time to be received. You've just walked away from your son's house. You're still processing what happened. The second envelope can wait. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand that he tell me everything immediately, that he stop parceling out my wife's final gifts like medicine administered in careful doses. But something in his tone stopped me. Thomas had known Eleanor for decades. If he said I was not ready, perhaps he was right. When? I asked. When you've stopped reacting and started rebuilding, you'll know. And when that day comes, call me again. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long time afterward, I sat motionless in that motel room, staring at the phone in my hands as if it might speak again, might offer some further piece of the puzzle Eleanor had constructed. My wife had protected me from beyond the grave. But Thomas said there was more. A second envelope waiting for later. The bills arrived at Daniel's house on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I walked out the front door. I was not there to witness it, of course, but I knew those bills intimately. I had been paying them quietly for years, intercepting the envelopes, before anyone else saw them, writing checks from my own account so that Daniel and Lauren could maintain the illusion that their comfortable life was entirely self-made. Homeowners insurance at $2,400 per quarter, property tax installments that climbed higher every year, the lawn service that kept their yard pristine, the security system that let Lauren sleep soundly at night. These were the invisible threads I had been weaving around their lives, and now those threads were unraveling. Daniel called me that afternoon. His voice carried the particular strain of someone trying to sound calm while standing in the middle of a crisis he does not fully understand. Dad, there's been some kind of mix-up with the mail. We're getting bills for things I've never even heard of. Insurance, property taxes, some landscaping company. He paused, and I could hear Lauren's voice sharp in the background, though I could not make out her words. Did you maybe forget to mention some arrangements you had? Something about automatic payments? I listened without interrupting. It was strange how distant his problems felt now, as if he were describing difficulties happening to someone else entirely. I didn't forget anything, Daniel. Those bills have always existed. I just handled them. Silence on the other end, then Lauren's voice again, closer now, demanding to know what I was saying. We'll manage, Daniel said finally, though his voice wavered in a way that suggested he was not entirely sure. It's just a lot to sort through all at once. I could picture the scene without effort. Lauren standing in their kitchen, surrounded by envelopes she had never noticed before, her carefully constructed sense of control crumbling with each new number she encountered. She would be pacing by now, I imagined, slamming papers down on the counter, muttering about being set up, about traps laid by a bitter old man who could not accept his place. This was never about the money for Lauren. It was about the fact that something had been happening in her own house, without her knowledge or permission. It was about discovering that her life had been quietly subsidized by someone she considered beneath her notice. The bills themselves were manageable. The loss of control was not. There's nothing to sort through, I said calmly. Those are your responsibilities now. I'm sure you'll figure it out. I ended the call before he could respond. Later that same afternoon, there was a knock at my motel room door. I was not expecting anyone. I had told no one where I was staying, had made no arrangements for visitors, had assumed I would spend these early days in complete solitude while I figured out what came next. But when I opened this door, Margaret Hill stood in the hallway holding a container of homemade soup. She smiled, as if my surprise was exactly what she had anticipated. Chicken noodle, she said, pressing the warm container into my hands. Eleanor's recipe. She made me promise to learn it. I stepped aside to let her in, still trying to understand how she had found me. Margaret settled into the room's single chair as if she had been there many times before, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings without judgment. How did you know where I was? I finally asked. Small-town Arthur, word travels. But her expression suggested there was more to it than small-town gossip. I've been waiting to hear that you'd finally left. Eleanor told me years ago that this day would come. She just didn't know exactly when. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the soup container warming my hands. Margaret watched me with an expression I could not quite read. Sympathy, perhaps. but also something fiercer, something that looked almost like satisfaction. Eleanor always said you were stronger than you looked, Margaret continued. She said you had a quiet kind of strength that people mistook for weakness, the kind that bends without breaking. She paused, her gaze steady. She was right. You're still standing. I didn't feel strong. I felt hollowed out, uncertain, like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was still waiting to discover whether he would fall or fly. But Margaret's words settled over me like a blanket I had not known I needed. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about the neighborhood, about the changes since I had been gone, about the small dramas that occupied people who had nothing larger to worry about. She did not ask what had happened with Daniel and Lauren. She did not offer advice or platitudes. She simply sat with me in that cramped motel room and reminded me that I was not entirely alone. Before she left, Margaret mentioned something almost as an afterthought. I ran into Daniel's wife at the grocery store yesterday. She was talking to someone on her phone, didn't see me in the next aisle. Margaret's voice turned carefully neutral. She said something about her parents visiting more often now that things were settling, maybe staying a while. Something about the back room being perfect for them. The back room. My room. The space Lauren had needed for something else. I thanked Margaret for the soup and watched her drive away from the motel parking lot. Then I sat by the window for a long time, thinking about rooms and replacements, and the ease with which some people discard what they no longer find useful. Comfort feels fragile when no one is quietly fixing things. And I was done fixing. The weeks that followed brought news in fragments, pieces of a picture I could assemble without being present to witness it myself. Margaret stopped by the motel every few days, always with some small offering. Soup, bread, once a slice of pie from the diner where she met friends for coffee. She never stayed long, but she always brought information. In a small town, she explained people talk, and Lauren had given them plenty to talk about. The vacation was the first thing to go. Daniel and Lauren had been planning a trip to the coast for months, the kind of getaway Lauren loved to mention at social gatherings. Beach house rental, seafood dinners, a week of carefully curated photographs to share with friends who measured success by the destinations one could afford. But the trip was quietly canceled. Lauren told her book club that something had come up at Daniel's work that they would reschedule for next year. But Margaret's friend from the book club noticed the way Lauren's smile tightened when she said it. Then came the car. Lauren had been talking about replacing her sedan since the previous fall, visiting dealerships on weekends, leaving brochures on the kitchen counter where Daniel could not miss them. A luxury SUV with leather seats and a navigation system she would never learn to use. But the brochures disappeared and the weekend dealership visits stopped. When someone asked about the new car, Lauren changed the subject. The dining out slowed to a trickle. No more spontaneous dinners at the Italian place downtown. No more brunches with friends at the cafe with the expensive omelets. Lauren started cooking at home more often, something she had always claimed to despise. The lifestyle she had presented so carefully to her social circle was beginning to crack, and everyone who knew her could see the fractures spreading. I understood even from a distance that the money itself was not what tortured Lauren. She and Daniel were not poor. They had good jobs, a manageable mortgage savings that most families would envy. What I had been providing was not survival. It was comfort. It was the difference between a life that looked successful and a life that looked extraordinary. What tortured Lauren was the loss of control. For years, she had believed herself the architect of her own circumstances. She made the decisions. She set the standards. She determined what their life would look like and how others would perceive it. But now she was discovering that someone else had been quietly holding the strings, and those strings had been cut without her permission. She called me on a Thursday evening. I was sitting by the motel window watching the sunset paint the highway in shades of orange and gold. When her name appeared on my phone screen, I considered not answering, but something made me pick up. Perhaps I wanted to hear what she would say. Perhaps I wanted to confirm what I already knew about who she really was. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Her voice was sharp, accusatory, the tone of someone who had spent days rehearsing this confrontation, walking out in the middle of the night like some kind of martyr, making us look like monsters. "Is that what you wanted to punish us, to make everyone feel sorry for poor Arthur?" I let her words wash over me without responding. She was not asking questions. She was making accusations dressed up as questions, the kind that expected no answer, because the answer did not matter. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Lauren. I'm just living my life." "Living your life?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're hiding in some motel feeling sorry for yourself while we're left dealing with the mess you created. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? I haven't done anything to your family. I simply stopped doing things for your family. There's a difference." Silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her searching for the next attack, the next angle that might wound me into submission. "Nothing. I'm just living my life," I repeated calmly. And then I hung up. I didn't answer when she called back. I didn't respond to the text messages that followed, each one more desperate and angry than the last. I simply turned off my phone and watched the last light fade from the sky. Daniel called the next morning. His voice was different from Lauren's, quieter, more uncertain. He did not accuse or attack. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything, whether I had thought about coming back. I answered politely but briefly. I was fine. I didn't need anything. I had not thought about coming back. Before he hung up, Daniel mentioned something almost in passing. He had been looking at their bank statements, trying to understand where all the money was going, now that unexpected expenses kept appearing. He noticed some transfers he did not recognize, money moving to an account that was not theirs. "I started to ask Lauren about it," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "But she gave me this look, you know the one, so I just closed the laptop and didn't bring it up again." I knew the look. I had seen it many times over the years. The look that said certain questions were not welcome, that certain boundaries should not be crossed, that peace in the household depended on not noticing things that demanded to be noticed. Daniel also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Lauren had been measuring my old room the week before. She had walked through it with a tape measure, making notes on her phone, talking about possibilities. She said it would make a perfect guest room, or maybe an office for her dad. Daniel paused. I didn't really think about it at the time. But now I'm not sure what to think. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. For a long time afterward, I sat with what he had told me. The strange transfers, the measured room, the plans being made without his knowledge or consent. Lauren was not just losing control of her circumstances. She was building something else, something hidden, something that even Daniel was not allowed to see. Power feels different when it no longer listens to you. Daniel came to see me 3 days later. He arrived at the motel without calling ahead, his car pulling into the parking lot just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. I watched him through the window, sitting in his vehicle for several minutes before he finally stepped out and walked toward my door. His shoulders were hunched in a way I had never seen before, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his frame. When I opened the door, he didn't greet me. He simply walked past me into the room and sat down in the single chair, staring at the floor. I closed the door and waited. Whatever had brought him here, he needed to find his own way to say it. "I came home early yesterday," he finally said. His voice was flat, drained of its usual defensive energy. "Left work around 2 because I had a headache. Lauren didn't know I was coming." He paused, and I could see him replaying something in his mind, watching a scene unfold behind his eyes that he wished he could unsee. "She was on the phone when I came in through the garage, talking to her mother. She didn't hear me." Daniel's hands clenched in his lap. Her voice was different, excited, like she was sharing a secret with someone she trusted completely. I stood in the hallway and listened. I said nothing. I could feel the shape of what was coming, the confirmation of suspicions I had been carrying since Margaret first mentioned Lauren's plans for my room. She said, "Once he's officially out of the picture, you and Dad can move in. The room's already empty. We just need to wait a few more weeks for everything to settle." Daniel looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Shame, perhaps, or the particular pain of someone who has finally allowed themselves to see what was always there. She wasn't talking about a visit, Dad. She was talking about replacement. Your room. Your place in our house. She wanted to erase you and put her own parents there instead. The words hung in the air between us. I had suspected something like this since Margaret's report about the grocery store conversation, but hearing it confirmed, hearing my own son describe his wife's calculated plan to substitute me with people who would worship her rather than see through her, carried a weight that suspicion alone could not match. I stood there in that hallway for I don't know how long, Daniel continued, just frozen, trying to understand what I was hearing, and then I started thinking about everything else. All the little things I'd been noticing but refusing to put together. He told me about the patterns he had begun to see. How Lauren questioned every expense that did not directly benefit her but never hesitated to spend on things that enhanced her image. How she spoke about the future in terms that always centered herself, her comfort, her preferences. How she had been measuring and planning and preparing for a version of their life that had no room for anyone who might challenge her control. "I thought about all the times she said things about you," Daniel said quietly. "All the comments I pretended not to hear, the way she talked about you like you were a burden we were generous enough to tolerate, and I never said anything. Not once. I just sat there and let it happen because I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to rock the boat. I chose peace over loyalty. I chose being comfortable over being your son." His voice cracked on the last word. I watched my son struggle with the recognition of who he had allowed himself to become, and I felt something I'd not expected. Not anger, not satisfaction at his suffering. Something closer to sorrow for both of us for the years we had lost to silence and avoidance. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet, but I'm watching now. Everything she says, everything she does, every plan she makes, I'm paying attention in a way I never did before." He met my eyes. "I'm not confronting her. Not yet. I need to understand the full picture first. I need to know what else she's been hiding." I recognized something in his words, in his approach. It was the same strategy I had adopted weeks earlier in this very room. No arguments, no accusations, just quiet observation, letting the truth reveal itself piece by piece. "The money transfers," he added. "I've been looking into them. She's been moving funds to an account I didn't know existed. Not huge amounts, but steady. A few hundred here, a few hundred there, building something, I don't know what yet." He stood up to leave, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. For not standing up for you. For pretending I didn't see what was happening in my own house." He swallowed hard. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do next." I nodded but did not offer the reassurance he might have been seeking. Some wounds cannot be healed with words. Some trust must be rebuilt through action alone. Daniel seemed to understand this. He didn't ask for forgiveness or absolution. He simply left, driving away into the gathering dusk. I stood by the window long after his taillights disappeared, thinking about silence and its many meanings. For years, Daniel's silence had been a weapon that cut me without leaving visible wounds. His refusal to speak, to defend, to acknowledge what was happening right in front of him. That silence had been complicity dressed as neutrality, betrayal disguised as peace. But now his silence had changed. It was no longer about fear or avoidance. It was about gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for a confrontation that might cost him everything he thought he had. A son's silence can wound deeper than words. But for the first time, Daniel's silence was not about fear. It was about watching. The week after Daniel's visit passed quietly. I had moved out of the motel by then, using some of the money Thomas had helped me access to rent a small, furnished apartment on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a bedroom, a kitchenette, and a window that looked out over a parking lot instead of a highway. It was mine. That was enough. I spent my days establishing small routines: morning coffee at the diner 2 blocks away, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evenings reading books I'd been meaning to finish for years. The silence that surrounded me now was different from the silence of Daniel's house. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being left alone, and I discovered that the two were not the same thing at all. I thought often about what Daniel had told me. Lauren's phone call with her mother, the plans she had been making, the secret account she had been building. I wondered what he was discovering as he watched her more carefully, what other patterns were emerging from the background noise of their marriage. But I didn't call him to ask. This was his journey now, his reckoning with the woman he had chosen over his own father. He would have to find his own way through it. The property tax bill arrived at Daniel's house on a Friday afternoon. I knew because Daniel sent me a brief text message that evening, just 2 sentences. "Big tax bill came today. Lauren is not handling it well." I could imagine the scene without difficulty. The envelope from this county assessor's office, the kind of official correspondence that demands attention. Lauren tearing it open, expecting something routine, finding instead a statement for $8,500 due within 30 days. Her confusion would have been genuine. She had no idea this expense existed because I had always handled it quietly, just like everything else. It was one of the larger invisible threads I had been weaving around their lives, and now it had snapped. I I did not respond to Daniel's message. There was nothing for me to say. The call came at 11 o'clock that night. I was already in bed, not quite asleep, but drifting toward it when my phone lit up with Lauren's name. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Perhaps I wanted to hear what she would say when her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Perhaps I wanted to witness the moment when control finally slipped beyond her reach. "This is your fault." Her voice hit me before I could even say hello. It cracked and wavered, caught somewhere between fury and tears. "You planned this. You set us up to fail. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Waiting to watch us drown while you sit in your little apartment feeling superior." I said nothing. I simply listened as she continued, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of accusation and self-pity. $8,000. $8,000 we don't have because you've been sabotaging us from the beginning. All those bills you never told us about. All those expenses you hid from us so you could spring them on us later. You wanted this to happen. You wanted to punish us for asking you to leave. Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted. Are you happy now? She was crying by this point, the angry tears of someone who has lost control and cannot understand how it happened. I listened to her sobs, her ragged breathing, the occasional curse she threw at me between gasps. I let her exhaust herself. Let the storm of her emotions spend its energy against the wall of my silence. When she finally paused, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, carrying no anger and no satisfaction, just simple truth. "I didn't plan anything, Lauren. I didn't set you up. I didn't hide expenses to punish you later. Those bills existed all along. You just never saw them because I was always there to catch them before they reached you." I paused, letting the words settle. "I didn't do anything to you. I just stopped doing things for you. I stopped catching you when you fell. That's not sabotage. That's just gravity." Silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her searching for a response, a counterattack. Something that would shift the blame back onto my shoulders where she so desperately wanted it to stay. "You could help us," she finally said, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier fury. "You could fix this. You have the money. I know you do. You could make this all go away." I agreed. "But I won't." "Why?" The word came out as almost a whisper. "Because you don't need me to fix your problems, Lauren. You need to learn that your problems exist. You need to understand that the life you've been living was never entirely yours. It was built on foundations you didn't lay and maintained by hands you never thanked." I took a breath. "I'm not punishing you. I'm just not saving you anymore. There's a difference." I hung up before she could respond. Then I turned off my phone and set it on the nightstand face down where its silence could not be broken. For a long time, I lay in the darkness of my small apartment listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the settling of an unfamiliar building. I waited for guilt to arrive, for regret to creep in around the edges of what I had done. Lauren was suffering. Her comfortable life was collapsing, and I had the power to stop it, to write a check and make it all go away, to return to being the invisible provider who kept everything running smoothly. But the guilt did not come. Neither did the regret. What came instead was something I had not felt in years, a loosening in my chest, a release of tension I had not even known I was carrying. For a decade, I had been holding up a structure that no one else could see, bearing a weight that no one acknowledged, afraid that if I stopped even for a moment, everything would come crashing down. Now I had stopped, and I was still standing. The crash was happening somewhere else, to people who had never appreciated what they stood upon. This time, I did not rescue her. And for the first time in a decade, I slept through the night. Thomas called me the following Monday morning. His voice carried that same careful weight I remembered from our first conversation, the tone of someone about to deliver something significant. "You're ready for the rest now," he said without preamble. "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I drove the 20 miles to his law firm, with my heart pounding against my ribs. The second envelope, the one Eleanor had left for later, for when I was strong enough to receive whatever truth it contained. I had thought about it often during my weeks in the motel and the quiet days in my new apartment. I had wondered what secrets my wife had been keeping, what observations she had recorded, what final message she had wanted me to hear, only after I had walked away from everything she knew I would eventually have to leave. Thomas's office was located in a converted Victorian house on a tree-lined street. I had been there many times over the years, signing documents and reviewing plans, but today the familiar surroundings felt charged with something I could not name. The receptionist showed me directly to his private office, where Thomas waited behind his desk with a manila envelope in his hands. "Sit down, Arthur." He gestured to the leather chair across from him. "This may take some time." He slid the envelope across the desk. It was heavier than I expected, thick with whatever Eleanor had left inside. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, the kind Eleanor had always preferred for her personal writing. The cover was worn from handling the pages filled with her familiar handwriting. I recognized the loops and curves of her script immediately, the way she formed her letters with such deliberate care. "She kept this during her final 2 years," Thomas explained quietly. "She gave it to me 6 months before she passed, with instructions that it should only be opened after you had left Daniel's house. She wanted you to understand what she had seen." I opened the journal to the first entry. The date was written in the upper corner nearly 3 years ago. Eleanor's words greeted me like a voice from beyond the grave. "Arthur brought over another check for Daniel today, $1,200 for some emergency Lauren manufactured." I watched his face when he wrote it, the way he smiled as if the money was nothing, as if giving meant nothing. But I saw the bank statement last week. He's been dipping into our retirement savings. He doesn't tell me because he knows I would object. He thinks if he gives enough, they will finally see him. They will finally love him the way he deserves to be loved. But Lauren doesn't love. She calculates, and Daniel has forgotten how to be a son. I turned the page, then another, entry after entry spanning months and years. Eleanor had documented everything. Every dismissive comment Lauren made when she thought no one important was listening. Every time Daniel looked away when his wife belittled his father. Every holiday gathering where I was seated at the edge of the conversation, included in body but excluded in spirit. Every check I wrote, every sacrifice I made, every piece of myself I gave away to people who received without gratitude and took without acknowledgement. One entry stopped me cold. The date was 18 months before Eleanor died during a family dinner I barely remembered. Lauren told her friend tonight that they built their life themselves with no help from anyone. Arthur was standing 10 feet away. He heard every word. I watched his face go. Still watched him absorb the blow without flinching, watched him continue clearing plates as if nothing had happened. Later I asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He is not fine. He has not been fine for years. But he cannot see it, because seeing it would mean admitting that his sacrifices have purchased nothing. His son is lost. His daughter-in-law is a predator. And my husband, the strongest man I have ever known, has been hollowed out so slowly that he does not recognize his own emptiness. The tears came without warning. They spilled down my cheeks and fell onto the pages of Eleanor's journal, blurring the ink of words she had written years ago. I wept for the first time since her funeral. Great shuddering sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than grief. I wept for the years I had wasted, for the love I had misplaced, for the wife who had seen everything and tried to protect me, even when I refused to protect myself. Thomas said nothing. He simply sat across from me and let me cry, understanding that some moments require witness rather than comfort. When I could breathe again, I turned to the final entry. The date was 3 weeks before Eleanor died, written in handwriting that trembled with the weakness of her failing body. "I cannot protect him while I am alive. If I speak, they will call me the interfering mother-in-law. They will poison Arthur against me, convince him that I am jealous or controlling or simply old and bitter. Lauren is skilled at such manipulations. Daniel will believe whatever keeps the peace, so I must protect Arthur from beyond the grave. Everything is in place. The property is secured. The documents are signed. Thomas knows what to do and when to do it. My only regret is that I will not be there to hold Arthur's hand when he finally sees the truth. But perhaps that is better. Perhaps he needs to find his strength alone without me there to lean on. I love him. I have always loved him. And I will love him still, even when I'm gone, even when he thinks he is alone. He is never alone. He carries me with him always." I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest, holding it the way I wished I could hold her one more time. The tears continued to fall, but they were different now. Not just grief, something cleaner, something like release. Eleanor had left me more than property. She had left me the truth, documented, dated, and undeniable. I kept Eleanor's journal on my nightstand for weeks afterward. Some mornings I would wake before dawn and read a few entries, letting her voice fill the quiet darkness. Other times I could not bring myself to open it at all, the weight of her love and her loss pressing too heavily on my chest. But knowing it was there, knowing she had seen everything and still believed in me, changed something fundamental in the way I moved through my days. Margaret began visiting more frequently after I told her about the journal. She would arrive in the late afternoon with small offerings, a loaf of bread from the bakery or a bag of apples from the orchard outside town. We would sit together in my cramped apartment and talk about things I had not discussed with anyone in years. Eleanor, loss, the particular grief of being discarded by the families we had built with our own hands and hearts. Margaret understood in ways that others could not. She had walked this road before me 15 years earlier when her own daughter-in-law had orchestrated her removal from the family she had spent decades nurturing. She knew the shame of feeling unwanted. She knew the confusion of wondering what she had done wrong, what she could have done differently, whether the fault lay in her own character rather than in the cruelty of others. And she knew the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of betrayal. "You need a better place," she told me one afternoon, looking around my small apartment with a critical eye. "This is fine for hiding, but you're not hiding anymore. You're living. You need somewhere that feels like living." She helped me find a new apartment near the town center. It was on the second floor of an older building, clean and bright, with large windows that looked out over the small park where children played on weekends and elderly couples walked their dogs in the early mornings. The rent was reasonable. The neighbors were quiet. And for the first time since I had walked out of Daniel's house, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than simply away. I discovered in those weeks that I had forgotten how to enjoy simple things. For so long, every pleasure had been shadowed by obligation. Every moment of rest had been interrupted by the awareness that someone, somewhere, needed something from me. But now, with no one expecting anything, I found myself rediscovering the small satisfactions I had abandoned years ago. Morning coffee at the diner 2 blocks from my apartment. The waitress learned my name and my order within a week, and there was something deeply comforting about being recognized for nothing more than showing up. Saturday walks through the farmer's market examining vegetables I had no intention of buying, listening to conversations between strangers about weather and grandchildren and the price of tomatoes. Evenings spent reading books I had started and abandoned during my years of invisible service, finally able to finish them without interruption. One afternoon, Margaret mentioned something that made me set down my coffee cup and stare at her. "Eleanor and I used to talk about you," she said carefully. "A lot, actually, more than you probably realized." "What did you talk about?" "Everything. Your marriage, your son, the way you gave and gave without ever asking for anything in return." Margaret paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. "She made me promise something, Arthur, before she died." "What kind of promise?" She shook her head slowly. "Not yet. You're stronger now than you were, but you're not ready for that conversation. When the time comes, I'll tell you everything. But not today." I wanted to press her. I wanted to demand answers the same way I had wanted to demand the second envelope from Thomas before he was ready to give it. But I had learned something about patience in recent weeks. Some truths need time to be received. Rushing them only diminishes their power. The senior center became my unexpected anchor. I had wandered in one morning looking for information about community resources, and the director, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, had taken one look at my background and asked if I would consider volunteering. They needed someone to help elderly residents navigate the maze of paperwork that seemed to multiply with every passing year. Insurance forms, government benefits, medical documentation, the kind of bureaucratic complexity that could overwhelm people who had spent their lives working with their hands rather than pushing papers. I said yes without hesitation. And in that simple agreement, I found something I had not expected. Purpose. Not the purpose of being needed by people who took me for granted. Not the purpose of solving problems so that others could pretend those problems never existed. But the purpose of being useful on my own terms, helping people who appreciated the help, making a difference that was acknowledged rather than invisible. The residents at the senior center thanked me. They looked me in the eye when they spoke. They asked about my day and listened to my answers. Such small things, really. Common courtesies that most people take for granted. But after years of being treated as furniture in my own son's house, those small courtesies felt like gifts beyond measure. I was not a provider anymore. I was not a burden. I was not invisible. I was simply Arthur Sinclair, 67 years old, a man with the right to exist and the freedom to choose how that existence would unfold. For the first time in years, I felt present, not needed, just present, and that was enough. They came to my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, 3 months after I had walked out of their house. I was returning from my volunteer shift at the senior center when I saw Daniel's car parked in the visitor space near the building entrance. My steps slowed as I approached. I had known this moment would come eventually. Lauren was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly. They were waiting in the hallway outside my door. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the carpet. He looked like a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world. Lauren stood beside him with perfect posture, her expression arranged into something soft and sorrowful. She had dressed carefully for this visit, modest clothing, minimal makeup, the costume of a penitent daughter-in-law coming to make amends. "Dad," Daniel spoke first, his voice strained. "Can we come in? We'd like to talk." I unlocked the door and let them enter. My apartment was small but tidy, the afternoon sunlight falling through the windows that faced the park. Lauren's eyes swept across the space, cataloging everything: the second-hand furniture, the books stacked on the coffee table, the photograph of Eleanor I had placed on the windowsill where the light touched it each morning. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the couch. I took the chair across from them, maintaining distance. Lauren began immediately, her voice trembling with what she wanted me to believe was genuine emotion. "Arthur, I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left, about how things were, about the mistakes I made." She dabbed at her eyes with the tissue she had been holding in her hand, clearly prepared for this performance. "I was wrong. I see that now. The way I spoke to you, the things I said, it wasn't fair. I was stressed and overwhelmed, and I took it out on you." She paused, waiting for me to respond. I said nothing. "We miss you, Dad." She continued, her voice breaking artfully on the words. "The house feels so empty without you. Daniel misses having his father around. The children ask about their grandfather. We're a family and families should be together." She reached out as if to touch my hand, then pulled back when I didn't move toward her. "Please come home. We can start over. We can be the family we were always meant to be." I watched her performance with a clarity I had not possessed before. The rehearsed pauses, the strategic tears, the careful construction of words designed to manipulate rather than communicate. I wondered how many times she had practiced this speech in front of a mirror, adjusting her expression until it conveyed the perfect blend of remorse and hope. "You don't miss me, Lauren." My voice was calm, carrying no anger and no accusation, just simple observation. "You miss what I provided. There's a difference." Her expression flickered, a crack in the mask quickly repaired. "That's not true. We miss you, the person, the father, the grandfather." "Then why did you measure my room for your parents before I had even left? Why did you tell your mother they could move in once I was officially out of the picture?" I watched her face carefully as I spoke. "Daniel told me. He heard you on the phone. You weren't planning a family reunion. You were planning a replacement." The softness drained from Lauren's features. Her posture stiffened. The tearful daughter-in-law disappeared, and in her place sat the woman I'd come to know over 10 years of quiet observation. The calculator. The controller. The one who counted other people's money. "After everything we did for you." Her voice hardened, the pretense of reconciliation abandoned. "We gave you a home when you had nowhere to go. We fed you, housed you, included you in our family. And this is how you repay us. By abandoning us when things get difficult. You owe us Arthur." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her but said nothing. He was watching now, I remembered, gathering information, but watching was not the same as acting. "What exactly did you do for me, Lauren?" I asked quietly. "Name one thing." Silence. "You gave me a room in a house I helped pay for. You fed me meals at a table I helped buy. You included me in a family that treated me like furniture." I held her gaze without flinching. "I paid for your renovations. I paid for your car. I paid for your children's education. I covered your insurance and your taxes and your emergencies. And in return, you gave me a bed and permission to exist in your presence. That's not generosity, Lauren. That's tenancy. And the rent I paid was far higher than anything you provided." Her mouth opened and closed. For once, she had no response prepared, no manipulation ready to deploy. She had come expecting the old Arthur, the one who apologized for inconveniences he did not cause, who smoothed over conflicts he did not create, who retreated into silence rather than speak uncomfortable truths. But that Arthur no longer existed. "I'm not coming back," I said. "Not today, not ever. The version of me that lived in your house, that paid your bills without acknowledgement, that accepted your contempt as the price of belonging, that man is gone. I buried him the same night I walked out your door." Lauren stood abruptly, her composure shattered. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice tight with fury. "When you're old and sick and alone, you'll wish you hadn't thrown away the only family you had." "I didn't throw away my family, Lauren. My family threw me away. I simply stopped pretending otherwise." She stormed out without another word. Daniel lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked almost like respect. Then he followed his wife out the door, leaving me alone in my small apartment with the afternoon light and the distant sounds of children playing in the park. I was not coming back to who I used to be, and she was finally starting to understand that. Daniel returned the next afternoon alone. I heard his knock and knew before I opened the door that something had shifted. The rhythm was different. Not the reluctant tap of a man accompanying his wife on an errand he wanted no part of. This was deliberate, purposeful, the knock of someone who had made a decision. He stood in the hallway looking like he had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled in a way that suggested he had put them on without thinking. The careful neutrality he had worn during yesterday's visit was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, the face of a man who had finally stopped pretending. "Can I come in?" His voice was hoarse. "I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago." I stepped aside and let him enter. He did not sit on the couch where he had perched uncomfortably beside Lauren the day before. Instead, he stood by the window staring out at the park, gathering himself for whatever confession he had come to deliver. "After we left yesterday, Lauren and I had a fight," he began slowly. "Not about you, about money. She wanted to know why I'd been looking at our bank statements so carefully lately. I told her I was just being responsible. She didn't believe me." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression I had not seen since he was a boy. Fear. Not the fear of confrontation that had kept him silent for so many years. Something deeper. The fear of finally seeing clearly. "I've been tracking those transfers, Dad, the ones to the account I didn't recognize. I finally figured out where the money was going." He swallowed hard. "She's been moving funds into a separate account, her name only. $47,000 over the past 2 years. A little here, a little there, always amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice unless I was looking." I said nothing. I had suspected something like this since Daniel first mentioned the strange transfers weeks ago. But hearing the number, hearing the scope of her preparation still landed with unexpected weight. "It's not illegal," Daniel continued. "The money came from our joint accounts. She has every right to move it. But she never told me. She never asked. She just quietly built herself an escape route while I was busy pretending everything was fine." He moved away from the window and sank into the chair across from me. His hands were trembling slightly. "That's not all. The phone call I told you about when she was talking to her mother about moving them in. I didn't tell you everything I heard." He met my eyes. "She said you were just the beginning. She said once you were gone and her parents were settled, she'd have the support system she needed to make her next move. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Now I do. She wasn't just planning to replace you, Dad. She was planning to replace me, too, or at least to have everything in place in case she decided I wasn't useful anymore." The words hung in the air between us. I watched my son struggle with the recognition of who he had married, who he had defended, who he had chosen over his own father again and again. "I knew," he said finally, his voice breaking. "That's the worst part. I knew she was treating you badly. I saw it every single day, the comments she made, the way she talked about you like you weren't even in the room, the way she made you feel like a burden for existing in your own son's house." Tears began to slide down his cheeks, but I was afraid. I was so afraid that if I said anything, if I stood up for you, I'd lose her. She'd leave me or make my life miserable or turn the kids against me. So I stayed quiet. I looked the other way. I let her tear you down piece by piece because I was too much of a coward to stop her. He was sobbing now, the kind of deep, shuddering sobs that come from years of suppressed guilt finally finding release. I chose her over you, Dad. Every single time I chose her over you, and I chose her over Mom's memory. He looked at me with devastated eyes. Mom would be so ashamed of me. She raised me better than this. She loved you so much, and I let someone treat you like garbage in your own family. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I can. I let the silence settle before I spoke. There was no satisfaction in watching my son break down, no vindication in hearing him finally acknowledge what I had endured, only a deep, weary sadness for all the years we had lost to his fear and my silence. I forgive you, Daniel. He looked up, hope and disbelief mingling in his expression. But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to how they were. I held his gaze steadily. You can't undo 10 years of silence with one conversation. You can't rebuild trust with a single apology. Forgiveness means I'm not carrying anger towards you anymore. It means I'm willing to move forward. But moving forward doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. You have to earn what comes next, through action, not words, through consistency, not promises. He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of what I was telling him. I understand, he said quietly. I'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes. I believed him. For the first time in years, I believed my son meant what he said. The question was whether he would have the courage to follow through when the cost became clear. Because the truth he had finally spoken would not save his marriage. It would end it, and we both knew it. My son had finally told the truth, but the truth would not save his marriage. It would end it. Margaret called me 3 days after Daniel's confession. Her voice carried a weight I had not heard before, a gravity that suggested the conversation she wanted to have was one she had been preparing for a long time. Come to my house this afternoon, she said. There's something I need to tell you. Something I promised Eleanor I would share when you were ready. I arrived at her small cottage at 3 o'clock. The house was modest, but immaculate, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Photographs lined the walls. Plants crowded the windowsills. The smell of fresh tea drifted from the kitchen where Margaret was preparing a tray. She set the tea on the coffee table between us, then retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf near the fireplace. The box was old, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. She placed it on the table beside the teacups and sat down across from me. Eleanor wrote me letters, she said quietly, over the last 5 years of her life. Not many, maybe a dozen in total, but each one mattered. She lifted the lid of the box, revealing a neat stack of envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. I kept every one. I stared at the letters, recognizing Eleanor's handwriting on the topmost envelope. My wife had been corresponding with Margaret for years, and I had never known. Another layer of the protection she had been building around me without my awareness. Before I show you these, I need to tell you something about myself. Margaret's hands folded in her lap, and she took a slow breath. Something I've never told you directly, though I suspect Eleanor shared pieces of it. She began to speak, and as she did, the shape of her past emerged from the shadows where she had kept it hidden. 15 years ago, Margaret had been living in the house she and her husband built together. After his death, she continued there alone, maintaining the property, paying the bills, assuming she would spend her remaining years in the home where she had raised her son. But then her son married a woman named Carolyn, and Carolyn had plans. It started small. Margaret said, her voice steady but tinged with old pain. Comments about how the house was too big for one person. Suggestions that I might be happier in a retirement community. Questions about my finances that felt like inventories rather than concern. The pattern she described was achingly familiar. The slow erosion of position, the gradual dismissal of worth, the transformation from mother to burden, from family member to obstacle. Within 2 years, I had signed papers I didn't fully understand. Carolyn handled everything, always with a smile, always with reassurances that she was looking out for my best interests. Margaret's jaw tightened. By the time I realized what had happened, I had lost my home. My savings were depleted. My son stood beside his wife and told me I was confused, that I had agreed to everything, that I should be grateful they were willing to help me find a nice facility. She paused, and I saw the ghost of that devastation cross her features. My son has not spoken to me in 14 years. I have grandchildren I have never met. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for my family was taken from me by a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her own comfort. The parallel to my own situation was unmistakable. Lauren had been walking the same path Carolyn had walked, using the same tactics, pursuing the same goals. The only difference was that I had escaped before the trap closed completely. Eleanor saw what happened to me, Margaret continued. She was one of the few people who believed me when I tried to explain. Everyone else thought I was bitter, or senile, or simply unable to accept that my son had grown up and moved on. But Eleanor knew. She watched the whole thing unfold, and it terrified her. Margaret reached for one of the letters and held it without opening it. She came to me about 4 years before she died. She sat right where you're sitting now and told me she could see the same patterns beginning in your family. Lauren's calculations, Daniel's weakness, your willingness to give until there was nothing left. Margaret met my eyes. She said, "I will not let this happen to Arthur. Help me." My throat tightened. I had known Eleanor was protecting me. I had read her journal, seen the evidence of her preparation. But I had not understood how deeply she had studied the danger, how carefully she had learned from another woman's destruction. "We planned everything together," Margaret said. "The property transfer, the sealed letters, the documentation of how Lauren treated you. I recommended Thomas Keller because he had helped me try to fight Carolyn years ago. He lost that battle, but he learned from it. Eleanor wanted someone who understood how these things worked, who wouldn't underestimate the enemy." Tears were forming in Margaret's eyes now, the first I had ever seen her shed. "I couldn't save myself, Arthur. I lost everything. My home, my son, my grandchildren, my place in the world." Her voice broke slightly. "But I could help Eleanor save you. I could make sure that what happened to me would never happen to you, and that was enough. That had to be enough." I reached across the table and took her hand. We sat together in silence, two survivors of the same quiet war, connected by a woman who had loved us both enough to learn from tragedy and build something stronger. Eleanor had learned from someone else's destruction, and the woman who lost everything had helped ensure I never would. The weeks following my conversation with Margaret carried a different quality than the ones that came before. Something had shifted inside me, a final piece settling into place. I understood now the full scope of what Eleanor had done, the network of protection she had woven around me with patience and foresight. That understanding brought with it a kind of closure I had not known I was seeking. I turned my attention to making my small apartment into something more than a temporary refuge. I hung Eleanor's photograph on the wall beside the window, positioned so that the morning light would touch her face each day as the sun rose. I bought a small plant for the windowsill, white lilies, like the ones she had always kept in our home. They required careful attention, regular watering, the right balance of light and shade. Tending them became a daily ritual, a quiet conversation with my wife that needed no words. The apartment gradually filled with the small markers of a life being rebuilt. Books on the shelves, a comfortable reading chair positioned near the window, a kitchen stocked with simple ingredients for meals I prepared myself. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress anyone, just the honest accumulation of a man learning to live on his own terms. My volunteer work at the senior center expanded beyond what I had originally imagined. Patricia, the director, noticed how the residents responded to me. They trusted me in ways they did not trust the younger staff members, who spoke too quickly and moved too efficiently through their problems. I understood their fears because I had lived them. I knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated as a burden, to watch your own family calculate your worth and find you wanting. I began helping residents understand their legal rights, simple things at first, explaining documents and clarifying language that lawyers wrapped in unnecessary complexity. But soon I was doing more, helping elderly men and women recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation, teaching them how to protect their assets from relatives who saw inheritance as something to be accelerated rather than earned, connecting them with resources like Thomas Keller, when the situations exceeded what my engineering mind could navigate alone. I found patterns in their stories, the same patterns Eleanor had documented in her journal, and Margaret had lived through 15 years ago. The gradual erosion of autonomy, the subtle redefinition from person to problem, the isolation that came when families decided that inconvenient truths were easier to ignore than address. My training as an engineer served me well in this new work. I could see the structures beneath the surface, identify the stress points, design solutions that would hold under pressure. Word reached me through Margaret that Daniel had moved out of the house. The details were sparse at first, filtered through the small-town network of gossip and speculation. But eventually, Daniel himself confirmed it during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. "Lauren and I are separated," he said, his voice carrying the exhausted calm of someone who had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. "I'm staying in an apartment near my office. The lawyers are working out the details." I didn't ask what had precipitated the final break. I didn't need to. The marriage Daniel had protected at all costs, the peace he had purchased with his silence and his complicity, had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Lauren's careful plans had unraveled. The exit strategy she had been building, the separate account with its $47,000, had been discovered and disclosed. The replacement she had arranged for me would never move into my old room. I felt no celebration at this news, no vindication, no satisfaction at watching the edifice of their comfortable life crumble into rubble. What I felt instead was something quieter, a recognition that the storm had passed and I was still standing. The winds that had threatened to destroy me had ultimately destroyed something else, something that had needed destroying, and I had survived to see the sky clear. Daniel called every few days now. Our conversations were short, often awkward, filled with the hesitations of two people learning to speak honestly after years of careful evasion. He told me about his apartment, his work, the slow process of disentangling his life from Lauren's. I told him about my volunteer work, the residents I was helping, the small satisfactions of my daily routine. We did not discuss the past directly. We did not rehash the years of his silence or my invisible sacrifice. Those wounds were still too fresh for examination, the scar tissue still forming. But there was something genuine in our exchanges that had been missing for a decade. He was trying. I could hear it in his voice, in the questions he asked, in the way he actually listened to my answers, instead of waiting for his turn to speak. One evening he asked if we could have dinner together. Not at a restaurant, not in some neutral territory designed to minimize discomfort, at my apartment. He wanted to see where I lived, how I had rebuilt what my life looked like, now that I was no longer invisible. I said yes. The dinner was simple. Roasted chicken, vegetables from the farmer's market, bread from the bakery Margaret had introduced me to. We ate at my small table by the window, watching the sunset paint the park in shades of gold and amber. Daniel complimented the food. I told him about learning to cook again after years of eating whatever was placed in front of me. We talked about the weather, about sports, about nothing of consequence. And somehow in that inconsequential conversation, something important was being rebuilt. When he left that evening, Daniel paused at the door. He looked around my apartment one more time, taking in the photographs and the books and the white lilies blooming on the windowsill. "It feels like you," he said quietly. "This place, it feels like you." It was the kindest thing he had said to me in years. After he left, I sat by the window and watched the last light fade from the sky. The park below was quiet. The children gone home for the evening, the dog walkers finishing their final rounds. I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment, the pain and the loss and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding. I was not surviving anymore. I was finally living. Daniel filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in early autumn. The papers were served at the house Lauren still occupied alone, delivered by a process server who had no idea of the history contained in those pages. Within days, the news had spread through our small community with the quiet efficiency that only small towns possess. I didn't spread it. I didn't need to. In a place where everyone knows everyone, where families have lived side by side for generations, information travels through channels that require no malice to operate. A comment at the grocery store, a whispered observation at the beauty salon, a question asked over coffee at the diner where I had become a regular. The truth found its own path into the light. People began asking me about the separation, at church on Sunday mornings, at the farmer's market on Saturday afternoons, at the senior center where my volunteer work had made me a familiar and trusted presence. They approached with careful curiosity, the hesitant concern of neighbors who sensed there was more to the story than they had been told. I did not lie to them. I did not dramatize or embellish. I simply told the truth quietly, without bitterness or self-pity. Yes, I had been living with Daniel and Lauren. Yes, I had left. Yes, there had been difficulties. When they pressed for details, I offered only what was necessary. I was not treated with respect. I was made to feel unwelcome in my own son's home. I chose to leave rather than continue accepting that treatment. The details filled themselves in. People remembered things they had observed over the years. Lauren's dismissive tone when she spoke about her father-in-law. The way I had seemed to shrink at family gatherings, always hovering at the edges, always serving, rather than being served. The expensive renovations and new cars that appeared while I wore the same clothes season after season. Patterns that had been invisible suddenly became clear when viewed through the lens of what they now knew. Margaret told me later what happened at church the Sunday after the divorce filing became public knowledge. Lauren arrived in her usual carefully assembled outfit, her smile fixed in place, ready to perform the role of the wronged wife navigating a difficult time. But the reception she received was not the sympathy she expected. Conversation stopped when she approached. People who had always greeted her warmly offered only polite nods before finding reasons to move away. The women she had considered friends avoided her eyes. The men who had admired her composure now looked at her with something closer to assessment than appreciation. After the service, an older woman named Dorothy Hartwell approached Lauren in the church parking lot. Dorothy was 83 years old, a widow who had known my family for decades, a woman who had never been afraid to speak her mind. "I heard what you did to Arthur Sinclair," Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "That poor man gave you everything, paid for your house, bought your car, put food on your table for 10 years, and you threw him out like garbage." She shook her head slowly. "Shame on you." Lauren had no response. For once, her arsenal of deflections and manipulations failed her completely. She stood frozen in the parking lot while Dorothy walked away, surrounded by witnesses who would carry the story to every corner of our community before nightfall. She called me that evening. I was sitting by my window watching the sunset paint the park in shades of orange and red when her name appeared on my phone. I considered not answering, but something told me this would be our final conversation, and I wanted to hear what she would say when everything she had built was crumbling around her. "You ruined me." Her voice was bitter, stripped of all pretense. "My reputation, my standing in this community, everything I spent years building, you destroyed it all." I listened to her anger, felt it wash over me without penetrating. There was a time when her accusations would have made me doubt myself, would have sent me scrambling to apologize for offenses I had not committed. That time had passed. "No, Lauren, I didn't ruin you." My voice was calm, carrying no satisfaction, no vindication, just simple truth. "The truth ruined you. I just stopped hiding it for you." Silence on the other end. Then the click of disconnection. I set the phone down and returned my attention to the sunset. The colors were deepening now, the sky shifting from orange to purple as the day released its final light. I thought about Lauren standing in that church parking lot, surrounded by the judgment she had always feared, stripped of the image she had polished so carefully for so many years. She had not lost money. The divorce settlement would leave her comfortable enough. She had lost something she valued far more than any bank account could measure. She had lost the image she had spent years constructing, the reputation she had built on foundations of deception and contempt. She had lost the power to control how others saw her. And for Lauren, that was the cruelest loss of all. 8 months passed like water, finding its natural course each day, flowing into the next with a rhythm I had forgotten existed. The urgency that had defined my years in Daniel's house, the constant awareness of being unwanted, the exhausting effort of making myself small enough to be tolerated, all of it had faded into memory. What remained was something I had not experienced since Eleanor was alive. Peace. My apartment had transformed from a refuge into a home. The walls held photographs, now images from different chapters of my life. Eleanor on our wedding day, radiant in white. Daniel as a boy, grinning at the camera with a fishing rod in his hands. My parents standing in front of the house on Maple Street, the house that Eleanor's foresight had preserved for me. The white lilies on my windowsill had flourished under my care, their blooms filling the room with a fragrance that reminded me of her every morning. The senior center had become the unexpected center of my new life. What began as simple volunteer work had grown into something more substantial. Patricia promoted me to a formal advisory role, helping elderly residents navigate the complex terrain of family conflicts and financial exploitation. My engineering background proved surprisingly useful. I could see structures and patterns, identify weak points, design solutions that protected vulnerable people from those who would take advantage of them. People trusted me. They came to my small office with their fears and their suspicions, their documents, and their questions. I listened the way Eleanor had always listened, with patience and without judgment. I helped them understand their rights, connected them with lawyers and social workers, taught them to recognize the warning signs I had missed for so long in my own life. It was the work Eleanor would have wanted me to do. Every person I helped felt like a conversation with her, a continuation of the protection she had built around me, extended outward to others who needed it. Daniel completed his divorce in the spring. The proceedings were contentious at times, Lauren fighting for every asset she felt entitled to, but in the end the settlement was fair. He kept his retirement accounts. She kept the money she had secretly accumulated. The house they had shared was sold, the proceeds divided, the physical structure of their failed marriage dismantled and distributed. He visits me every Sunday now. We watch football together in my small living room, sharing pizza or Chinese food, talking about sports and weather and the small events of our separate weeks. The conversations are different than they were before, honest in ways they never were during the years of his marriage. He asks about my work at the senior center. I ask about his job, his apartment, the life he is slowly rebuilding from the wreckage of his choices. We do not speak often about Lauren or the years I spent in their house. Those wounds have scabbed over but not fully healed. Sometimes Daniel will mention something in passing, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly, and I will see the shame cross his face before he pushes it back down. He is learning to be a son again. It is slow work, awkward at times, but genuine in ways that matter more than smoothness ever could. Lauren moved away 2 months after the divorce was finalized. She could not bear the whispers that followed her through grocery stores and church services, the looks that assessed and judged her wherever she went. The image she had spent years constructing had shattered beyond repair, and she lacked the tools to build something new in its place. Margaret heard she relocated to a city 300 miles away, somewhere she could start over as a stranger, somewhere the name Sinclair carried no history and no weight. I visited Eleanor's grave on a Sunday morning in late summer. The cemetery was quiet, the grass freshly mowed, the headstones casting long shadows in the early light. I brought white lilies from my windowsill, the blooms she had always loved, and placed them gently against the cool granite that bore her name. "You saved me," I said quietly, my hand resting on the stone. "Even from beyond. You saw what I refused to see, and you built walls around me that held when everything else fell apart." I paused, feeling the morning breeze move through the trees that lined the cemetery paths. "I finally understand my love. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. And I'm living now. Really living. The way you always wanted me to." I stayed for a long time, speaking to her about the senior center and the people I was helping, about Daniel's visits, and the slow repair of our relationship, about Margaret and the friendship we had built from shared survival. Eleanor did not answer, of course, but I felt her presence in the warmth of the sun on my face, in the rustle of leaves overhead, in the peace that had finally settled into my bones. That evening I sat on a bench in the park near my apartment with Margaret beside me. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the kind of display that seemed too beautiful to be accidental. We did not speak. We did not need to. Two survivors of the same quiet war, connected by loss and love, and the woman who had brought us together. I thought about the night I had walked out of Daniel's house with a single suitcase and a heart full of confusion. I thought about the motel room where I had waited for anger that never came. I thought about Thomas and his envelopes, Margaret and her letters, Eleanor, and the journal that had shown me I was never as alone as I believed. They did not lose me that night. Lauren spoke those words. They lost the version of me that sacrificed everything to be loved, the man who gave without receiving, the father who accepted contempt as the price of belonging, the invisible provider who had forgotten he had the right to exist. That man was gone, and I did not mourn him. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving trails of purple and orange across the darkening sky. Margaret reached over and patted my hand once, a simple gesture that said everything words could not. I had survived. I had rebuilt. I had found peace, and I had finally become the man Eleanor always believed I could be. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story was not just about revenge or justice. It was about something deeper. It was about recognizing your own worth when the people closest to you have forgotten it. It was about finding the courage to walk away from those who take you for granted, even when walking away means walking into the unknown. It was about the love that protects us even from beyond the grave, and the friendships that catch us when our families let us fall. Perhaps you saw yourself in Arthur. Perhaps you know someone like Lauren or Daniel. Perhaps you have been the invisible provider in your own family, giving everything and receiving nothing but contempt in return. If any part of this story touched your heart, I hope it also gave you permission to believe that you deserve better. That your silence does not have to be permanent. That it is never too late to set boundaries and reclaim your dignity. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever had to walk away from people who refuse to see your value? Share your story with our community. You might be surprised how many others understand exactly what you have been through. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary strength in the face of betrayal and loss. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, please share this video with them. Sometimes a single story can change everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you are never too old to become the person you were always meant to be.